The fluorescent lights in FBI Interrogation Room B buzzed with a low, agonizing hum. It was a sterile, windowless box that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Across the steel table sat Special Agent Miller, a man whose exhausted eyes had seen every variation of human greed. He tapped his pen against a manila folder, looking at the frail, silver-haired woman sitting opposite him. She was wearing a slightly oversized beige cardigan. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling faintly. "Mrs. Foster," Agent Miller started, his voice adopting that patronizing, gentle tone reserved for toddlers and the elderly. "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to talk about Nexus Ed Tech. We need to talk about the wire transfers." The woman stopped trembling. Slowly, she lifted her head. The stooped posture vanished. The vacant, confused stare that had defined her existence for the last 6 months evaporated, replaced by a gaze so sharp and crystalline it made Miller physically recoil. "Agent Miller," Diane Foster said, her voice steady, crisp, and devoid of any frailty. "They told you I have early onset Alzheimer's. They told you I couldn't remember my own grandson's middle name. But do you know the funniest thing about being labeled a senile old woman?" Miller stared at her, the pen frozen in his hand. "What?" Diane leaned forward, resting her forearms on the cold steel table. "Nobody bothers to hide their paper trail when they think you can't even read the calendar." 6 months earlier. "Day 45 of caring for a dementia patient," Victoria whispered into her iPhone camera, framing her face perfectly to capture the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. She let out a heavy, perfectly rehearsed sigh, running a hand through her perfectly styled blonde balayage. It's a journey, you guys. Some days are so dark, but we do it for love. #caregiver. Burnout, #dementia awareness, #family first. She tapped the screen, ending the recording, and her expression instantly dropped into a cold, flat mask of irritation. Diane sat at the kitchen island, quietly eating her oatmeal. She didn't look up, but she absorbed every detail. Victoria Foster, her daughter-in-law, was an artist, but her canvas wasn't paint. It was perception. To her 30,000 Instagram followers, Victoria was a saint, a brilliant edtech startup founder who sacrificed her peace of mind to care for her ailing mother-in-law. The reality was a meticulously crafted psychological prison. "Here are your pills, Margaret," Victoria said, sliding a small plastic cup across the marble counter. "It's Diane, dear," Diane murmured, keeping her voice tremulous and soft. "Right, Diane," Victoria corrected, not bothering to hide her eye roll. "Take them. You forgot them yesterday. Remember?" Diane didn't argue. She looked down at the pills. Her prescribed blood pressure medication was a small white oval. The pill in the cup was round and chalky. Over-the-counter Benadryl, a sleep aid. Enough to make a 68-year-old woman groggy, slow to respond, and unsteady on her feet by noon. Just in time for the neighbors to come over for Victoria's weekly charity brunch. Diane palmed the pill with the sleight of hand she'd perfected over the last month, pretending to swallow it with a sip of water, then slipping it into her cardigan pocket. "Good girl," Victoria said, already turning back to her laptop. This was the gaslighting. It started small, Victoria moving Diane's reading glasses and watching her search for hours. Changing the Wi-Fi password and telling Diane she must have forgotten how to use her iPad. Then the isolation. Victoria insisted Diane wasn't safe to drive, selling her Honda Civic and confining her to the upscale, suffocatingly quiet suburban house. Diane played along. She dragged her feet. She asked the same question twice in an hour. She let Victoria paint her as a fading mind. Why? Because Diane Foster wasn't just a retired widow. She spent 40 years as a forensic accountant for a top-tier firm in Chicago. She had spent her life tracing laundered money, offshore accounts, and corporate embezzlement. She knew that when someone begins systematically stripping away your autonomy, there is always a ledger. There is always a financial motive. She just needed to find it. The front door unlocked, and Aaron walked in. Diane's son looked like a ghost of the vibrant young man he used to be. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. "Hey," Aaron mumbled, dropping his briefcase by the door. Your mother wandered into the street again today, Aaron, Victoria said instantly, not even greeting him. It was a blatant lie. Diane had been sitting in the sunroom all morning. Mrs. Higgins brought her back. It was humiliating. It's getting too dangerous to keep her here. Aaron flinched, refusing to make eye contact with his mother. I'll look into full-time care facilities this week, Vic. I promise. They're $10,000 a month, Aaron. Where is that coming from? We're bleeding cash as it is, Victoria snapped, though a micro-expression of triumph flashed across her eyes. Diane watched her son. He didn't defend her. He didn't question his wife. He just nodded, looking utterly defeated. Diane felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she swallowed the emotion. Emotion was a liability. She needed data. The break came on a rainy Tuesday. Victoria had booked herself a 4-hour self-care session at a downtown spa, claiming caregiver fatigue. Aaron was at the office. Diane was supposedly napping in her room. Instead, Diane was standing by the mahogany console table in the foyer, sifting through the day's mail. Victoria usually intercepted the mail, holding the key to the locked mailbox. But today, the substitute mail carrier had carelessly left a secondary bundle wedged in the magazine slot. Diane flipped through the catalogs and utility bills until her hand stopped. It was a thick, official-looking envelope from the Department of the Treasury, the Internal Revenue Service. But it wasn't addressed to Diane's current residence. It was addressed to Diane Foster, CEO, Nexus EdTech Holdings, with a forwarding sticker slapped across it. Diane's heart rate spiked. She took the envelope to the kitchen counter, carefully slicing it open with a paring knife so it could be resealed if necessary. She unfolded the thick packet. It was a notice of deficiency, CP3219A. Diane's trained eyes scanned the numbers, automatically bypassing the bureaucratic jargon and locking onto the figures. Outstanding tax liability, $142,500. Her breath hitched. You don't get a $142,000 tax bill unless you are reporting, or failing to report, millions in revenue. But the real gut punch was the employer identification number, EIN, listed on the document. It was tied directly to her Social Security number. What have you done, Victoria? Diane whispered to the empty kitchen. That night, she waited until 2 a.m. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the central AC. Diane slipped out of her bed, leaving her orthopedic slippers behind to walk silently in her socks. She navigated the dark hallway with the precision of a burglar, stopping in front of Victoria's home office. The door was locked. Victoria always locked it. But a digital keypad lock on an interior door is child's play if you know what to look for. Diane had spent weeks observing Victoria punch in the code, noting the slight wear on the numbers 0, 4, 1, and 8. Victoria's anniversary, 0418. The lock clicked green. Diane slipped inside, easing the door shut. The room smelled of Victoria's expensive lavender diffuser. Diane sat at the sleek oak desk and woke up the iMac. Password protected. Diane didn't panic. She pulled a small, encrypted USB drive from her pocket, a tool from her consulting days she had kept hidden inside the lining of her winter coat. She booted the Mac in recovery mode, bypassing the local admin password within 4 minutes. She opened Victoria's local drive. It was a labyrinth of folders, labeled with innocuous names like School District Outreach and Marketing Q3. But Diane didn't look at the names. She looked at the file extensions and metadata. She searched for .csv and .xlsx files that had been modified in the last 48 hours. She opened a master spreadsheet encrypted under a folder named Personal/Family Photos. As the data populated on the screen, the blood drained from Diane's face. The blue light of the monitor illuminated a sprawling, horrifying digital empire. This wasn't a simple case of elder financial abuse. Victoria hadn't just stolen Diane's retirement savings or forged a check. It was synthetic identity fraud. Victoria had taken Diane's pristine 80-year credit history and her Social Security number, But she hadn't just used Diane's name. She had fractured it, creating synthetic profiles. D. Foster, Diane M. Foster, Margaret D. Foster. She attached different fake birth dates and ghost addresses to these variations, essentially creating 4 entirely new people in the eyes of the credit bureaus. These synthetic identities had been used to secure massive business lines of credit, federal small business relief loans, and equipment financing for Victoria's startup, Nexus EdTech. Diane scrolled down, row after row of fraudulent accounts, 7 credit cards maxed out, a $250,000 SBA loan, a commercial lease in downtown Chicago, over $2.1 million in leveraged debt. And Aaron? Diane found his name on the incorporation documents. Victoria had listed Aaron as the chief financial officer, but the ultimate guarantor, the CEO, the person solely responsible in the event of a default or a federal audit, was Diane Foster. Diane sat back in the leather ergonomic chair, the silence of the room suddenly deafening. The brilliance of Victoria's web was terrifying. If the Ponzi scheme collapsed, and looking at the burn rate on the spreadsheet, it was weeks away from imploding. The creditors and the feds would come knocking. And who would they find? Victoria, the innocent, hardworking founder? No, they would find Diane, a woman with a documented, publicly broadcasted medical history of severe dementia. If Diane went to trial, the defense would claim she had lost her mind and engaged in erratic financial behavior. More likely, she would be deemed unfit to stand trial, quietly shipped off to a state-funded psychiatric facility, while the money sat safely in whatever offshore accounts Victoria had funneled it into. Victoria wasn't just planning to steal her house. She was planning to use Diane as a human shield against the United States federal government. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Diane froze. Heavy, sluggish footsteps approached the office door. Aaron. He was likely getting up for a glass of water. With lightning speed, Diane ejected her USB, shut down the iMac, and slipped silently behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the doorknob rattled. It didn't open. Aaron grunted, muttered something to himself, and shuffled past towards the kitchen. Diane stood in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited 10 full minutes before slipping out of the office and returning to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, staring at the faint outline of her own hands. The trembling was gone. The confusion was gone. A cold, absolute clarity washed over her. Victoria thought she was playing a game of checkers, pushing an old, broken woman off the board. She didn't realize she had just invited a master auditor to a game of high-stakes chess. Diane pulled the over-the-counter Benadryl pill from her cardigan pocket. She placed it on her nightstand, right next to her picture of her late husband. Tomorrow she would be more confused than ever. Tomorrow she would forget Aaron's name. She would give Victoria exactly the performance she needed. Because the only way to dismantle a synthetic trust fund was from the inside, and a ghost is the perfect auditor. The spider web was perfect. But the spider didn't know the fly was a hornet. The house felt less like a home and more like a terrarium. Every morning, the HVAC system hummed, the smart blinds opened at exactly 7 a.m., and the perimeter security system chirped a polite synthetic beep whenever an exterior door was opened. It was a gilded cage, and Victoria was the warden. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere in the house grew thick with a frantic, concealed energy. Diane noticed the subtle shifts. Victoria was spending more time in her office, her voice muffled but sharp through the solid oak door. Deliveries from high-end boutiques stopped arriving. The daily organic meal prep service was abruptly canceled, replaced by whatever Victoria could throw together from the local grocery store. The burn rate on the synthetic credit lines was catching up to her. Nexus EdTech was bleeding out, and Victoria was accelerating her timeline. She needed liquid assets. She needed Diane's $3 million mortgage-free house. On a Thursday morning, Diane was sitting in the living room, a crocheted blanket draped over her lap, staring vacantly at a daytime talk show. The front doorbell rang. Victoria rushed from the kitchen, smoothing down her cashmere sweater. She opened the door, her face instantly melting into an expression of exhausted relief. "Dr. Thorne, thank you so much for coming." Diane didn't turn her head, but her pulse quickened. Dr. Thorne. She had seen his name in Victoria's browser history. He wasn't a neurologist affiliated with a reputable hospital like Northwestern or Rush. He was a concierge physician, the kind who catered to wealthy suburbanites, prescribing whatever medications were requested, providing discreet, at-home evaluations for a steep out-of-pocket premium. Of course, Victoria, I know how difficult this transition is for families, a smooth baritone voice replied. Footsteps approached the living room. Diane kept her eyes fixed on the television screen, her mouth slightly slack. "Diane?" Victoria said softly, stepping into her line of sight. "Diane, sweetheart, this is Dr. Thorne. He's just here to have a little chat with you. See how you're doing." Dr. Thorne stepped forward. He wore a tailored suit under a crisp white lab coat, a theatrical touch that told Diane everything she needed to know about his ethics. He smiled, a practiced, comforting grimace. "Hello, Mrs. Foster. Lovely house you have here." "Who are you?" Diane asked, letting her voice quiver, pitching it half an octave higher than normal. "Are you the man to fix the boiler? Arthur said the boiler was making a noise." Arthur, her late husband, had been dead for 12 years. Victoria let out a tragic little sigh, placing a hand on the doctor's arm. "She's been asking for him all morning." "I see," Dr. Thorne murmured, pulling a leather-bound notebook and a pen from his breast pocket. He pulled up a chair, sitting knee to knee with Diane. "Mrs. Foster, I'm going to ask you a few simple questions. It's nothing to worry about. Can you tell me what year it is?" It was the Mini Mental State Examination, MMSE. Diane had studied the diagnostic criteria for cognitive impairment during a massive Medicare fraud case she audited back in 2014. She knew exactly how the scoring worked out of 30 points. Score too high, and Victoria's plan is ruined. Score too low, and Dr. Thorne might recommend immediate involuntary psychiatric lockdown. She needed to thread the needle. She needed to score a 19, moderate impairment. Plausible enough for a conservatorship, but functional enough to remain in the house for a few more weeks. "Year?" Diane blinked, looking around the room as if the answer were printed on the wallpaper. "It's 1998, I believe. Or 99. Dr. Thorne scribbled in his notebook. "Okay, can you tell me what day of the week it is?" "Thursday," she answered correctly. "You couldn't miss them all. It looked rehearsed." "Very good. Now I'm going to name 3 objects. I want you to repeat them back to me and try to remember them for later. Apple, table, penny. Apple, table, penny," Diane repeated slowly. For the next 10 minutes, Diane played the role of a fading mind with Oscar-worthy precision. She successfully subtracted 7s from 100 a few times before getting confused and stopping. When asked to spell the word world backward, she spelled it DLROW, deliberately transposing the middle letters. When asked to draw 2 intersecting pentagons on a blank piece of paper, her hand trembled, leaving a messy, open-ended sketch that looked like a broken kite. "And finally, Mrs. Foster," Dr. Thorne said gently, "do you remember those 3 words I asked you to memorize earlier?" Diane stared at him, her eyes wide, glassy, and completely hollow. "What words?" Dr. Thorne offered a sympathetic smile, closing his notebook. "That's perfectly all right, Diane. You did wonderfully. Why don't you go back to your program?" He stood up, gesturing for Victoria to follow him into the kitchen. Diane remained perfectly still in her armchair, her eyes on the TV, but she tilted her head just a fraction to catch the acoustics bouncing off the hardwood floors. "It's advanced, Victoria." Dr. Thorne's voice floated down the hallway, hushed but clinical. "She lacks temporal orientation. Short-term recall is severely compromised, and her executive function is deteriorating. She is in no condition to manage her own medical care, let alone her finances." "It breaks my heart," Victoria said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "She's been so independent, but she almost left the stove on yesterday. My son, Leo, was in the house. I can't let her endanger herself or my family." "You're doing the right thing," Thorne reassured her. "I will draft the declaration of incapacity today. My office can recommend a family law attorney who specializes in adult guardianships. With this evaluation, petitioning the court for a full conservatorship of the estate in person should be a formality. Thank you, doctor. Will this give me the authority to transition her to a residential care facility? Once the judge signs the order, yes. You will have full legal authority over her domicile, her assets, and her medical decisions. You become her legal proxy. Diane's fingernails dug into her palms until they threatened to draw blood. A full conservatorship. The ultimate legal trap. Once Victoria was appointed her conservator, Diane would legally cease to exist as an autonomous adult in the eyes of the state. She wouldn't be able to hire a lawyer, access a bank account, or even choose what she ate for breakfast. Victoria would gain immediate, uncontested access to Diane's unencumbered assets, perfect for liquidating the house to pay off the massive synthetic debt accumulated by Nexus EdTech. Victoria was forging the chains. Diane had to break them before the judge swung the gavel. That evening, a heavy thunderstorm rolled off Lake Michigan, pounding the large bay windows of the suburban house. The power had flickered twice, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. Victoria was upstairs, putting 5-year-old Leo to bed. Aaron was in the study. The door was ajar. Diane stood in the darkened hallway, listening. She heard the clink of glass against crystal, followed by the heavy exhalation of a man drowning in his own life. Aaron was drinking again. He had been drinking a lot lately. Diane looked down at her hands. The time for playing the helpless invalid was over, at least for a moment. She needed to know the exact topography of the battlefield. She needed to know if her son was a co-conspirator who deserved to burn with his wife, or a casualty of war who needed extracting. She pushed the heavy oak door open. Aaron sat behind the mahogany desk, a half-empty tumbler of scotch in his hand. The only light came from the brass desk lamp, casting harsh shadows over his drawn, exhausted face. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Mom?" he slurred slightly. "You should be in bed. Vic gave you your medication." Diane didn't shuffle. She didn't stoop. She walked into the room with the straight-backed, authoritative posture she used to command boardrooms. She walked over to the antique globe in the corner, opened the hidden compartment, and pulled out a second crystal tumbler. She walked to the desk, poured herself 2 fingers of Aaron's Macallan 18, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Aaron stared at her, the alcohol evaporating from his brain in an instant of pure, unfiltered shock. "Mom?" "The medication went down the bathroom sink, Aaron," Diane said, her voice crisp, sharp, and brutally clear. "Just like it has for the last 3 weeks." Aaron's jaw actually dropped. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to dispel a hallucination. You're senile? Demented?" Diane offered a cold, humorless smile. "No, I'm a forensic accountant who spent 40 years putting embezzlers in federal prison. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the smell of cooking books in my own home?" Aaron shrank back into his leather chair, his face turning the color of ash. Diane set her glass down with a heavy thud. She placed both hands flat on the desk, leaning in until she was inches from his face. "I saw the notice of deficiency from the IRS, Aaron. I broke into her encrypted drive. I know about the $2 million in leveraged debt. I know about the synthetic identities she created using my social security number." Aaron squeezed his eyes shut, a low, agonizing groan escaping his throat. He brought his hands up to his face, his shoulders shaking. "What I want to know," Diane said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is how deep you are in this. Did you help her steal my identity, Aaron? Are you helping her put me in a home so you can sell this house to cover the burn rate of her fake company?" "No!" Aaron snapped his head up, tears spilling over his lower eyelids. "God, no, Mom. I swear to you, I didn't know anything about the identities. I didn't know she was using your SSN until it was too late." "But you knew about the fraud," Diane pressed, her gaze unrelenting. "I found out 8 months ago," Aaron confessed, his voice cracking. He reached for his scotch, but his hand was shaking too badly. He pulled it back. "I thought Nexus was real. We had an office. We had investors. But then I saw the wire transfers. She wasn't building software, Mom. She was paying off early investors with money from new loans. It's a Ponzi scheme. A massive, gaping hole. And you stayed quiet. I tried to confront her. Aaron's voice pitched into a desperate, hushed hiss. I told her we needed to declare bankruptcy, go to the authorities, try to mitigate the fallout. Why didn't you? Aaron looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a terror so profound it made Diane's stomach drop. Because she showed me the paper trail, Mom. Aaron choked on a sob. When she incorporated Nexus, she made me chief financial officer. I signed the tax returns. I signed the SEC filings. I signed the loan guarantees. You were a proxy, a figurehead. Any competent defense attorney could prove she was the mastermind, Diane countered, though a cold dread was beginning to coil in her gut. No, they couldn't, Aaron whispered, his voice completely broken. Because she doctored the internal emails. For 2 years, she used a VPN and spoofed my IP address to send emails from my account to hers, instructing her to move the money. She created a digital footprint that makes it look like I am the mastermind, and she was just following my orders. If the feds raid us, the digital forensics will point straight to me. Diane stared at her son. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of Victoria's contingency plan left her momentarily speechless. Victoria hadn't just built a fraud empire, she had built a scapegoat. She told me, Aaron continued, tears freely tracking down his cheeks, that if I breathed a word to anyone, if I didn't play along, she would trigger an anonymous tip to the FBI. She told me federal wire fraud carries 20 years. She told me Leo would grow up visiting his father behind reinforced glass, while she played the victim of a manipulative criminal husband. Twist 2. Diane felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Aaron wasn't a co-conspirator helping his wife steal from his mother. Aaron was a hostage. He was a prisoner in his own home, paralyzed by the fear of losing his son and spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Victoria was using him to pacify Diane, and using Diane's impending dementia to create a financial lifeboat for herself. So you agreed to let her declare me incompetent, Diane said, her voice softer now, lacking the earlier venom. She said it was the only way. Aaron wept, burying his face in his hands. She said if we got the conservatorship, we could sell this house, pay off the most aggressive creditors, and quietly fold the company without triggering an audit. She promised me you would go to a luxury facility. She promised she wouldn't hurt you. He looked up, his face a mask of self-loathing. I'm a coward, Mom. I'm a coward, and I'm so sorry. Diane looked at her broken boy, the son she had raised to be kind, gentle, and trusting. Those exact traits had been weaponized against him by a predator. If Diane went to the FBI right now, Victoria would go down. But Victoria would drag Aaron down with her. The spoofed emails, the signatures, the Department of Justice wouldn't care about the nuances of a toxic marriage. They cared about convictions. Aaron would serve time. Leo would be placed in the foster system while Victoria awaited trial. Or worse, Victoria might negotiate a plea deal and keep custody. Saving herself wasn't enough anymore. Diane walked around the desk. She placed a firm, steady hand on Aaron's trembling shoulder. The time for anger was over. It was time for absolute, calculated war. Aaron, listen to me, Diane commanded, her voice vibrating with an iron certainty. You are going to wipe your face. You are going to finish that drink. And tomorrow, you are going to act exactly as you have been. You will be the stressed, submissive husband. Aaron looked up, confused. Mom, you can't fight her. Can't fight. The conservatorship hearing is in less than 3 weeks. Once a judge signs it, you're legally dead. You need to pack a bag and run. Get a lawyer. Leave me. I don't run, Diane said softly, her eyes glinting in the dim light of the study. And I don't leave my family behind to burn. She turned toward the door, adopting her slight stoop, preparing to slip back into the skin of the senile old woman. What are you going to do? Aaron whispered into the dark. Diane paused at the threshold, not looking back. I am going to let Victoria think she has won. I am going to let her back me right up to the edge of the cliff, because that, my sweet boy, is the only place where she will be arrogant enough to make a mistake." Diane stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the thunder masking the soft click of the door closing. The spider had woven a brilliant web, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the prey she had caught. Diane wasn't going to break the web. She was going to pull the threads until the spider strangled itself. To the telehealth psychiatrist sitting behind a screen 500 miles away, the patient was a tragic, rapidly declining elderly woman. The illusion was flawless. Victoria had bypassed the greatest hurdle of a conservatorship, the rigorous, independent medical evaluation, without Diane ever stepping foot outside the house. Diane's hands hovered over the keyboard, hovering over her own stolen face. Twist 3. This was the terrifying frontier of modern fraud. Victoria hadn't just forged a signature on a paper check. She had weaponized artificial intelligence to legally erase Diane's autonomy. The AI voice clone, trained on hours of Victoria's innocent Instagram videos, captured the exact raspy cadence of Diane's voice. The deepfake filter mapped Diane's wrinkles, the droop of her eyelids, and the silver of her hair onto Victoria's or an actor's face in real time. She opened the corresponding lab reports. Complete blood counts, metabolic panels, urinalysis, all bearing the logo of a national diagnostic lab. They were perfectly forged PDFs, showing elevated cortisol levels and markers consistent with severe cognitive decline. Victoria had built a medical history so bulletproof that any family court judge in the state would sign a conservatorship order without a second thought. Beep. The cloning progress bar on Diane's tablet hit 100%. Suddenly, the low rumble of the garage door opener vibrated through the floorboards. Victoria was home early. Diane's pulse spiked, but her movements remained surgically precise. She ejected the micro SD card, unplugged the adapter, and shoved them deep into the pocket of her cardigan. She meticulously closed every window on the iMac, leaving the mouse exactly where she had found it, parallel to the edge of the keyboard. She slipped out of the office, leaving the door ajar just as it had been, and shuffled into the living room. By the time Victoria walked through the kitchen door, shaking her wet umbrella, Diane was sitting in her armchair, staring blankly at a muted television screen, her hands trembling with perfectly rehearsed frailty. "Dan?" Victoria called out, her voice sharp. She walked into the living room, her eyes darting suspiciously toward the hallway that led to her office. "What are you doing sitting in the dark?" Diane didn't look at her. She slowly turned her head toward the window, her voice a hollow, airy whisper. I thought I heard Arthur pulling into the driveway. Is he home for dinner?" Victoria exhaled a sharp breath, the tension leaving her shoulders. The suspicion vanished, replaced by that familiar cold contempt. "Arthur is dead, Diane. He's been dead for 12 years. I'll heat up some soup." Diane nodded slowly, turning her vacant eyes back to the television. Inside her cardigan pocket, her fingers traced the edge of the micro SD card. She had the bullet. Now she just needed the gun, but she was running out of time. The storm hit on a Friday evening. It wasn't a literal storm. The Chicago sky was a clear, bruised purple, but the atmospheric pressure inside the Foster house had reached a suffocating density. Aaron had come home from work looking physically ill. His skin was the color of old parchment, and he couldn't hold eye contact with anyone. Not even his 5-year-old son, Leo, who had mercifully been sent to a sleepover at a friend's house. At 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite, neighborly ring. It was 2 sharp, authoritative buzzes. Diane was sitting at the dining room table, a half-eaten bowl of minestrone soup in front of her. Victoria immediately stood up, smoothing her skirt. She didn't look surprised. "I'll get it," Victoria said, her voice eerily calm. Aaron squeezed his eyes shut. His hands, resting on the mahogany table, gripped the edges so hard his knuckles turned white. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Diane's heart hammered against her ribs. The end game was here. Footsteps echoed in the foyer. Victoria walked back into the dining room, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Dr. Thorne, clutching his black leather medical bag. Next to him was a man Diane didn't recognize, a tall, slickly dressed man in a charcoal suit carrying a thick briefcase. And standing in the hallway, framing the entrance like bouncers, were two burly men wearing EMT uniforms. Through the front window, Diane could see the flashing amber lights of a private psychiatric transport van idling in the driveway. "Diane," Victoria said, dropping the sweet caregiver facade entirely. Her voice was pure steel. "This is Scott Jennings. He is my family law attorney. And you remember Dr. Thorne?" Diane looked around the room, letting her mouth hang slightly open, adopting the posture of a terrified, confused old woman. What is happening? Aaron, who are these men?" The lawyer, Jennings, unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He placed them on the dining table, right next to Diane's soup bowl. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and laid it on top of the papers. "Mrs. Foster," Jennings said smoothly, the kind of voice used to finalize hostile corporate takeovers. "We have filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship with the county court, based on Dr. Thorne's assessment and your extensive telehealth psychiatric history." Diane looked at the papers. It was a durable power of attorney and an advanced healthcare directive, specifically authorizing Victoria to transfer her to a locked memory care facility. "You have two choices tonight, Diane." Victoria stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a predatory triumph. "You can sign these documents, granting me legal authority over your care and your estate. If you do, Doctor, Thorne will administer a mild sedative, and these nice gentlemen will drive you to Serenity Pines. It's a beautiful facility, very peaceful." "And if I don't?" Diane's voice trembled perfectly. "If you don't," Thorne interjected coldly, "I am legally authorized under state law to place you under a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold, a 5150. You will be strapped to a gurney, taken to the county psychiatric ward, and held against your will until the judge rubber stamps the conservatorship on Monday morning. Either way, Diane, you are leaving this house tonight. Signing just makes it dignified." Diane looked at Aaron. Her son was weeping silently, his head bowed, utterly broken by the blackmail Victoria held over him. If Diane broke character now, if she stood up and revealed she was completely lucid, if she told the lawyer about the deepfakes, it would trigger a massive legal investigation. Victoria would panic, the fraudulent company would be exposed, and Aaron's spoofed emails would send him straight to federal prison. She couldn't play her cards yet, but she absolutely could not get into that van. Once she was behind locked psychiatric doors, drugged with actual antipsychotics, her brilliant mind would be rendered useless. She needed a disruption. A massive, undeniable disruption. And she needed to do it without breaking her dementia facade. I don't understand," Diane whimpered, standing up slowly. Her knees knocked together. She looked wildly around the room, her breathing turning shallow and frantic. She began to hyperventilate, stepping away from the table. "You're trying to steal my house. Arthur, where are you?" "Stop it, Diane. Arthur isn't coming," Victoria snapped, gesturing to the EMTs. "Gentlemen, she's becoming agitated. Please prepare the restraints." The two large men stepped into the dining room. Diane backed away, moving purposefully toward the front hallway. "No! Get away from me! Intruders! Help!" "Mom, please just calm down," Aaron sobbed, finally standing up, but Victoria shot him a lethal glare that pinned him to the spot. Diane's back hit the wall in the foyer. To her left was a heavy antique crystal vase resting on a pedestal, an anniversary gift from Arthur. To her right, mounted at shoulder height, was the ADT Home Security Master Panel. The EMTs reached out to grab her arms. In a fraction of a second, the frail, trembling old woman vanished. With a sudden, explosive burst of adrenaline, Diane grabbed the heavy crystal vase. She didn't swing it at the men. She pivoted and hurled it with all her might directly into the massive front bay window. Crash! The explosive sound of shattering glass tore through the house. The window spiderwebbed and blew outward, raining glass onto the porch. Before anyone could react to the noise, Diane slammed her palm against the ADT security panel, flipping the plastic cover and smashing the bright red button labeled Police Panic. A deafening 120 decibel siren instantly ripped through the house. The strobe lights on the porch began flashing wildly. Victoria screamed, covering her ears. The two EMTs froze, stumbling backward. "What the hell is she doing?" the lawyer Jennings yelled over the ear-splitting siren, his slick composure entirely shattered. "Turn it off, Aaron, turn it off!" Victoria shrieked. Aaron rushed to the panel, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't punch in the 4-digit code. But it didn't matter. A panic button activation on a monitored system is an immediate, uncancelable dispatch. Diane sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, crying hysterically. She was the perfect picture of a terrified, sundowning dementia patient reacting to a perceived threat. "You idiots!" Jennings shouted at Victoria and Thorne, furiously shoving his legal documents back into his briefcase. "You can't execute a quiet, involuntary psychiatric hold with an active police dispatch for a domestic disturbance. The cops will show up, see a shattered window, a screaming elderly woman, and 2 goons trying to drag her away. It's going to trigger an immediate Adult Protective Services investigation." "We have the medical paperwork!" Victoria screamed back, her face flushed with absolute panic. "The cops don't care about your paperwork in the middle of a 911 response," Jennings roared, heading for the back door. "If APS gets involved, they freeze all her assets pending an investigation. I am not losing my law license over a botched kidnapping. Get that ambulance out of the driveway, now!" Dr. Thorne didn't wait to be told twice. He grabbed his medical bag and sprinted out the back door after the lawyer. The EMTs, realizing the legal nightmare they were about to step into, immediately bolted out the front door, jumping into their transport van and peeling out of the driveway just as the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the affluent suburban streets. Victoria stood in the middle of the foyer, surrounded by shattered glass, the deafening alarm still blaring. She looked down at Diane, who was still rocking on the floor, weeping. But as Victoria looked closer, she saw something that made the blood freeze in her veins. Diane's face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with apparent sobs. But through the gaps in her fingers, Diane's eyes were locked dead onto Victoria's. There were no tears in those eyes. There was no fear. There was only a cold, calculating, predatory stillness. It was the look of a grandmaster who had just sacrificed a pawn to protect the queen. Red and blue police lights swept across the shattered living room walls. The ambush had failed. Victoria had brought a net, but Diane had just burned the entire forest down. She had bought herself the weekend. And for a forensic accountant with a cloned hard drive, a weekend was all it took to build a guillotine. The morning after the shattered window, the Foster house was a tomb. A local glass repair company had come at dawn to board up the front bay window with a thick slab of plywood, plunging the foyer into a perpetual, dusty twilight. Victoria paced the hardwood floors like a caged leopard. The police had come and gone the night before. Just as the lawyer, Jennings, had predicted, the flashing lights and Diane's hysterical, Oscar-worthy performance of a terrified dementia patient had completely derailed the involuntary psychiatric hold. The cops had taken a report for a medical episode resulting in property damage and filed a mandatory notification with Adult Protective Services. A PS wouldn't investigate until Monday at the earliest, but the damage to Victoria's timeline was catastrophic. She couldn't move Diane. She couldn't get the conservatorship signed over the weekend. And Nexus EdTech had a $200,000 balloon payment due to a predatory private lender by Tuesday morning. Victoria was out of time, out of liquid cash, and running entirely on fumes and Adderall. Upstairs in her master bedroom, Diane sat on the edge of her bed. The door was locked. The frail, shaking elderly woman was entirely gone. Her posture was ramrod straight, her eyes sharp and cold. Resting on her lap was the iPad Victoria had given her to play games and keep her mind active. Victoria thought Diane spent 6 hours a day staring blankly at digital jigsaw puzzles. But Victoria didn't understand the first rule of cybersecurity. Never give a network-connected device to an auditor inside your own firewall. Twist 4. Diane tapped a sequence of hidden gestures on the screen. The colorful puzzle app vanished, replaced by a black terminal command screen. For the past 3 months, Diane hadn't just been playing the victim. She had been acting as a digital Trojan horse. Using the home's Wi-Fi, she had installed a packet sniffer, a piece of software that intercepts and logs data traffic, on the router. Every time Victoria logged into her Nexus EdTech accounts, every time she communicated with the deepfake actor, and every time she spoofed Aaron's IP address to frame him, Diane's silly little iPad had silently recorded the keystrokes and network pathways. Combined with the cloned hard drive she had secured from Victoria's office, Diane now had the entire anatomy of the fraud. She opened an encrypted messaging app she had buried inside a weather application. She typed in a number she hadn't used in 6 years. Diane. Marcus, it's Diane Foster. 3 minutes passed. The screen lit up. Marcus. Diane? Jesus, I heard you retired and moved to the suburbs. Tell me this is a social call. I'm at my kid's soccer game. Marcus Vance was a senior investigator at FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a bureau of the Department of the Treasury. He was Diane's former protege. He knew her mind was sharper than a scalpel. Diane, it's not a social call. I'm sending you a secure drop link. I need you to pull the metadata and run a trace on a series of shell companies registered in Delaware under the Nexus EdTech umbrella. Marcus, Diane, I can't just run unauthorized federal audits because you asked. I need probable cause. A warrant. Diane's fingers flew across the digital keyboard with terrifying speed. Diane. The drop link contains proof of $2.1 million in synthetic identity fraud, aggravated identity theft using deepfake telehealth consultations, and a conspiracy to commit Medicare fraud. The primary suspect is attempting to frame her husband, my son, by spoofing his MAC address to authorize wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Caymans. The typing bubble appeared on Marcus's end. It stayed there for a long time. Marcus, who is the primary suspect? Diane, my daughter-in-law, and she has me trapped in my own house under the guise of advanced Alzheimer's. If I walk into a local police station, she'll trigger the spoofed emails and my son goes to federal prison for 20 years. I need her to go down for a crime so heavily federalized that the DOJ takes jurisdiction before the local courts can grant her a conservatorship over me. Marcus, I'm pulling into my office now. Send the packet. What's your play? Diane looked up from the screen. Through the floorboards, she could hear Victoria aggressively yelling at someone on her cell phone, her voice cracking with desperation. Victoria was a cornered animal, and cornered animals don't think rationally. They bite at the first piece of meat they see. Diane, I'm going to give her the rope. I need you to be ready to pull the trap door. Diane closed the encrypted app. The black terminal vanished, and the screen returned to a bright, cheerful picture of a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. She stood up, walked to her closet, and pulled an old leather shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were stacks of old financial documents, tax returns from the 90s, and Arthur's old life insurance policies. She dug to the bottom and pulled out a specific folder with thick, cream-colored parchment paper. It was time to set the honey trap. Sunday evening. The house was quiet, save for the relentless drumming of a new rainstorm against the roof. Victoria was sitting at the kitchen island, a half-empty bottle of Pinot Noir to her right, her laptop open in front of her. The blue light illuminated the dark circles under her eyes. She was staring at a foreclosure warning for the Nexus office lease. She rubbed her temples, suppressing a scream of pure frustration. Diane shuffled into the kitchen. She was wearing her oversized cardigan, her hair slightly disheveled. She dragged her orthopedic slippers across the tile, carrying the old leather shoebox under one arm. Victoria didn't even look up. There's leftover soup in the fridge, Diane. Don't bother me. I can't find Arthur's cufflinks, Diane murmured, her voice airy and distressed. She placed the shoebox on the kitchen island, right next to Victoria's wine glass. She began haphazardly pulling papers out of the box, letting them spill onto the marble counter. He needs them for the Rotary Club dinner. Arthur is dead, Victoria snapped, slamming her laptop shut. Put that garbage away and go back to your room. But the bank sent this, Diane said, her hands trembling as she pushed a thick cream-colored document toward Victoria. It says I need to sign it. For the boy. For Leo. Victoria sighed angrily, grabbing the document to shove it back into the box. But as her eyes caught the heavy black letterhead at the top of the page, her hand froze. Vanguard Institutional Trust Services Account Type, Generation Skipping Transfer, GST, Trust Beneficiary, Leo Aaron Foster, Current Liquid Value, $512,450 US. Victoria stopped breathing. Her eyes darted across the page, devouring the text. It was a trust fund. A secret, fully funded liquid trust that Arthur and Diane had set up years ago for their grandchild. Victoria had scoured Diane's tax returns and local bank accounts for months, but she had never seen this. Why? Because it was an institutional trust, parked off the grid of standard consumer banking, requiring a specialized dual authentication to access. "Diane," Victoria said, her voice suddenly dropping an octave. The irritation vanished, replaced by a smooth, predatory purr. "What is this?" "I don't know," Diane whimpered, rubbing her forehead as if in physical pain. "The man from the bank called. He said the money is just sitting there. He said I have to move it to my checking account or they tax it. I don't remember the password, Victoria. I can't remember anything." Victoria's eyes gleamed with a toxic, desperate light. $500,000. Liquid cash. It was enough to pay off the balloon loan, float the company for another 6 months, and finalize her escape plan. It was an absolute godsend. "Oh, Diane, sweetheart," Victoria cooed, sliding off her bar stool and wrapping an arm around Diane's stooped shoulders. "It's okay. You don't need to worry your pretty head about this. I can help you." "You can?" Diane looked up, her eyes wide and trusting. "Of course. That's what family is for." Victoria smiled, a terrifying shark-like grin. She pulled the document closer. "It says here you just need to log into the Vanguard portal. Do you remember where you keep your passwords?" "In my little blue book," Diane stammered. "In my nightstand. But the iPad is so hard to type on." "Don't worry about the iPad," Victoria said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Go upstairs, get the blue book. I'll set up my laptop for you. We'll do it together." Diane nodded obediently, turning and shuffling toward the stairs. As soon as Diane's back was turned, Victoria practically lunged for her laptop. She opened a browser, routing her connection through a commercial VPN to mask her IP address, a habit she had formed while committing identity fraud. She quickly navigated to the Vanguard Institutional login page. If Victoria transferred this money to Diane's local checking account, it would still be trapped. Victoria wouldn't have access to it until the conservatorship was finalized. But Victoria was greedy, and she was desperate. She didn't want the money in Diane's account. She wanted it offshore, in the Cayman Island LLC she had set up under one of Diane's synthetic identities. 10 minutes later, Diane returned to the kitchen, clutching a small, worn blue address book. Victoria had her laptop angled away from the center of the room. "Sit here, Diane," she instructed, pointing to the stool next to her. "What's the username?" Diane opened the book, squinting at the pages. "It says d.foster_1955, and the password is Arthur Forever, with an exclamation point." Victoria's fingers flew across the keyboard. She was in. The dashboard loaded, displaying the glorious 6-figure balance in bright green font. "Okay, Diane, I'm going to help you transfer this so it doesn't get taxed," Victoria lied smoothly. She navigated to the external wire transfer menu. She didn't select Diane's Chase checking account from the drop-down menu. Instead, she manually entered the SWIFT code and routing number for the Cayman Island offshore account. Diane stood next to her, watching the screen with a vacant expression. But beneath the facade, her mind was calculating the exact federal statutes Victoria was currently violating. By logging in with Diane's credentials, it was identity theft. By entering an offshore routing number, it was international money laundering. By clicking the Initiate Transfer button across state lines, it was federal wire fraud. "It's asking for a 2-factor authentication code, Diane," Victoria said, her voice tight with suppressed anxiety. "Do you have your cell phone?" Diane patted her cardigan pockets. She pulled out her old iPhone and handed it to Victoria. A text message popped up on the lock screen. "Vanguard alert, your verification code is 849211. Victoria snatched the phone, typed the code into the laptop, and clicked Authorize Wire Transfer. A green checkmark appeared on the screen. Transfer initiated. Funds will clear in 24 to 48 business hours. Victoria exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. She had done it. She had saved herself. She closed the laptop, turning to Diane with a sickeningly sweet smile. "All done, Diane. See? Nothing to worry about. The money is safe." "Thank you, Victoria," Diane whispered. She picked up her blue book and slowly shuffled back toward the hallway. "Sleep well, Diane," Victoria called after her, already pouring herself a fresh glass of wine, celebrating her brilliant victory. Upstairs, Diane walked into her bedroom and locked the door. She didn't go to sleep. She walked to her dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out her encrypted tablet. She opened the secure messaging app to Marcus. "Diane. The trap is sprung. She just initiated an unauthorized international wire transfer of $500,000 using my credentials and a compromised IP address. Marcus, I see it on the FinCEN network monitor. The receiving account in the Caymans is flagged. The funds are frozen in transit. We have the digital fingerprint, Diane. It's an open and shut federal wire fraud case." Diane stared at the screen, the culmination of months of psychological torture, gaslighting, and humiliation finally crystallizing into a single, lethal legal weapon. "Diane, when do we move? Marcus, the FBI Chicago field office is drafting the arrest warrant now. We execute on Thursday. Happy Thanksgiving, Diane." Diane turned off the tablet. She walked to the window, looking out at the dark, rain-soaked suburban street. Victoria thought she had just secured her freedom. She had no idea she had just locked the door to her own federal prison cell. Thursday was Thanksgiving. Victoria was hosting a massive dinner for the extended family to keep up the appearance of the perfect, loving caregiver. It was supposed to be Diane's final meal before the conservatorship was finalized, and she was shipped to the memory care ward. Diane smiled. It was a cold, sharp, terrifying smile. Thursday was going to be a bloodbath. Thanksgiving morning in the Foster household smelled like a lie. The rich, buttery scent of roasting turkey and sage stuffing wafted through the HVAC system, masking the suffocating tension that had settled into the drywall. Victoria was in her element. She wore a tailored burgundy dress, a pristine white apron tied around her waist, and a flawless smile. Her iPhone was mounted on a ring light in the corner of the kitchen, recording a hyperlapsed video of her preparing the holiday feast. "Thanksgiving is about gratitude, everyone," Victoria said to the camera, pausing to wipe a perfectly staged smudge of flour from her cheek. "This year has been incredibly hard. Caring for someone with cognitive decline tests your spirit. But looking at Diane, knowing we are keeping her safe, that's what family is all about. #Thanksgiving, #caregiver strong." She stopped the recording, her smile instantly vanishing. She walked over to the kitchen island, pulled her laptop from sleep mode, and refreshed the browser tab. Cayman Offshore Holdings. Account Nexus_001 incoming wire transfer. $512,450. Status, pending clearance. Victoria frowned slightly, tapping her manicured nail against the marble counter. It had been 3 days since she initiated the wire transfer from Diane's secret Vanguard trust. The funds hadn't posted to her offshore account yet. A brief spike of anxiety hit her chest, but she quickly rationalized it. It was a holiday week. International transfers of $500,000 always triggered manual banking reviews, and Thanksgiving slowed everything down. Besides, the conservatorship hearing was officially scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. Dr. Thorne had filed the deepfake telehealth psychiatric evaluations with the county clerk. Once the judge signed the order, Victoria would have legal authority to liquidate the house and the rest of Diane's local assets. The offshore money was just the cherry on top. She was invincible. Upstairs, Diane Foster was sitting at her bedroom window, watching the street. The sky was the color of bruised iron, spitting freezing rain onto the asphalt. Twist 5. Victoria didn't know how the federal banking system actually worked. She thought she had outsmarted a senile old woman by transferring the funds over a VPN. But Diane hadn't just left a random trust fund document on the counter. She had orchestrated a federal sting. That $512,450 didn't belong to a standard generational trust. Years ago, after Arthur passed, Diane had restructured her assets. The Vanguard account was flagged in the FinCEN database as a monitored asset, a specialized trap designed by financial crime units to track unauthorized access. When Victoria clicked Authorize Wire Transfer, the money didn't go to the Cayman Islands. It was immediately intercepted and frozen in a federal escrow account by the Department of the Treasury. More importantly, the act of attempting to wire $500,000 of stolen funds across international borders using a compromised identity instantly elevated Victoria's crime from local elder abuse to a Class B federal felony. International wire fraud. Local police need a domestic disturbance to knock on your door. Adult Protective Services need 3 days to process a complaint. The FBI? The FBI just needs a judge's signature on a Thursday morning. Diane stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her gray wool slacks. She walked to the mirror. For 6 months, she had practiced looking hollow, weak, and broken. Today, she let the facade slip, just for a moment. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her eyes sharp and merciless. She was the chief auditor, and it was time to close the books. By 3 p.m., the house was full. Victoria's parents, her 2 sisters, and several cousins had arrived, filling the living room with the loud, oblivious chatter of a family that only cared about appearances. Aaron sat in the corner of the living room, nursing a glass of bourbon. He looked physically ill. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled every time he took a sip. To Aaron, this was a funeral. He believed this was the last meal his mother would ever eat in her own home before Victoria locked her away in a psychiatric ward on Monday. He was paralyzed by the blackmail Victoria held over him, the spoofed emails that would send him to prison and tear his son away from him. Diane shuffled into the room, leaning heavily on a cane she didn't actually need. The room went quiet for a fraction of a second, the guests exchanging pitying, uncomfortable glances. "Oh, look who's awake!" Victoria's mother, a woman dripping in cheap jewelry, cooed loudly. "Diane, sweetheart, do you know what day it is?" "It's Turkey Day." Diane didn't answer. She let her eyes drift vacantly past the woman, her face a mask of tragic confusion. She slowly made her way to the armchair by the fireplace and sat down. She caught Aaron's eye across the room. Aaron looked away, his jaw clenched, tears shining in his eyes. Diane didn't break character, but she allowed a microscopic, razor-sharp smile to touch the corner of her lips, a silent promise to her son. "Hold on." Dinner was served at 5 p.m. in the grand formal dining room. The table was an absurd display of wealth. Crystal wine glasses, sterling silver cutlery, and a massive, perfectly glazed turkey resting on a porcelain platter. 14 people sat around the table. Diane was seated at the far end, next to Aaron. Victoria sat at the head of the table, presiding over her kingdom. As the wine flowed and the plates were filled, Victoria clinked her fork against her crystal glass. The chatter died down. Victoria stood up, smoothing her apron, her face adopting a mask of profound, saint-like sorrow. "Before we eat, I want to say a few words," Victoria began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. "This year has taught me the true meaning of sacrifice. Family isn't just about the good times. It's about doing the hard, painful things to protect the people we love." She looked down the table at Diane, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears. "As many of you know, Diane's condition has deteriorated rapidly. It breaks my heart, but keeping her here is no longer safe for her, or for little Leo. This Monday, Diane will be transitioning to Serenity Pines, a specialized memory care community where she will get the 24/7 psychiatric help she needs." A murmur of sympathy rippled through Victoria's family. Her mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. It's the hardest decision Aaron and I have ever had to make, Victoria continued, placing a hand over her heart. But we do it out of pure love, to Diane. She raised her glass. To Diane, the guests echoed, raising their wine glasses. Aaron didn't raise his glass. He stared at his empty plate, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. Diane looked at the raised glasses. She looked at Victoria, standing at the head of the table, bathing in the tragic glory of her own lies. It was time. Diane didn't shuffle. She didn't tremble. She placed both hands flat on the table and stood up. The movement was so smooth, so entirely devoid of frailty, that the person sitting next to her actually gasped. "I appreciate the toast, Victoria," Diane said. Her voice wasn't a raspy, confused whisper. It rang through the dining room like a judge's gavel, crisp, authoritative, and terrifyingly clear. The wine glasses stopped mid-air. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Victoria's smile froze. Her eyes darted over Diane's posture. The stoop was gone. The vacant stare was gone. Staring back at her from the end of the table was a predator. "Diane?" Victoria stammered, the first crack in her armor appearing. "Sweetheart, you're confused. Sit down." "I'm not confused, Victoria. In fact, I'm the only person in this room who sees the balance sheet exactly as it is," Diane said, walking slowly out from behind her chair. She didn't use the cane. She walked with the measured, predatory grace of a woman in total control. "Mom?" Aaron whispered, his head snapping up. "Aaron, get her pills. She's having an episode," Victoria said, her voice rising in panic. She looked at her father. "Dad, help me get her upstairs." "Nobody is going upstairs," Diane commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. Victoria's father, who had half stood, immediately sat back down, intimidated by the sheer force of Diane's tone. Diane reached into the pocket of her slacks. She pulled out her iPad and dropped it onto the center of the dining table, right next to the gravy boat. "Let's talk about your sacrifices, Victoria," Diane said, her eyes locked onto her daughter-in-law. "Let's talk about Nexus Ed Tech. Let's talk about the $2.1 million in leveraged debt you accumulated by stealing my social security number and creating synthetic identities." Victoria turned the color of ash. The blood drained from her face so fast she swayed on her feet. I don't know what you're talking about." "You're insane." "Am I?" Diane tapped the screen of the iPad. An audio file began to play at maximum volume. It wasn't just any audio file. It was the recording Diane had captured on her hidden packet sniffer. Victoria's voice, clear as day, screaming at a private lender over a VoIP call. "I told you you'll get your money on Tuesday. The old lady is being committed on Monday. I have full power of attorney. The house goes on the market by Wednesday. Back off or I'll burn the LLC and you get nothing." The audio echoed through the dining room. Victoria's mother covered her mouth in horror. The guests stared at Victoria as if she had suddenly grown horns. "You forged my medical records." Diane listed the charges clinically, stepping closer to Victoria. "You used deepfake software to impersonate me on telehealth calls to secure a fraudulent psychiatric diagnosis. And worst of all, you blackmailed my son. You spoofed his IP address to make him the fall guy for your Ponzi scheme." Victoria was hyperventilating now. The facade had completely shattered. She looked around the room, desperate, cornered. "Aaron! Aaron, do something! She's ruining everything." Aaron slowly stood up. He looked at his wife, the woman who had held his life hostage, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't cower. "She's not sick, Vic," Aaron said, his voice trembling but resolute. "And I'm not playing your game anymore." "You'll go to prison!" Victoria shrieked, all pretense of the sweet caregiver abandoned. Her face contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl. "I'll send you to federal prison, Aaron. The emails have your MAC address. I'll destroy you." "No, you won't," Diane interrupted softly. She stopped pacing. She stood at the end of the table, looking at her watch. "Because 3 days ago, you logged into my Vanguard Trust account. Diane said, delivering the final fatal blow. You attempted to wire $500,000 to a Cayman Island offshore account, but you didn't know that account was a FinCEN honeypot, Victoria. You didn't just steal from me. You committed a Class B federal felony. You crossed state lines and international borders. And the United States Department of Justice does not take kindly to wire fraud. Victoria staggered backward, bumping into the antique china cabinet. The crystal inside rattled. No, the money is pending. It's just pending. The money is frozen, Diane said coldly. And so are you. Right on cue, as if orchestrated by a master conductor, a sound echoed through the house. It wasn't a doorbell. It was a heavy, booming knock on the solid oak front door. 3 loud, terrifying strikes that vibrated through the floorboards. FBI, open the door, we have a warrant! Victoria let out a guttural, animalistic scream. She lunged toward the back door of the kitchen, knocking over her chair in a frantic, mindless bid to escape. The front door didn't wait to be opened. A battering ram smashed through the lock. The heavy wood splintered, and a dozen men and women in tactical gear, wearing windbreakers emblazoned with FBI's and Treasury agent, flooded into the foyer. Don't move! Keep your hands where we can see them! The dining room erupted into chaos. Victoria's family screamed, backing away from the table. Aaron put his hands in the air, tears streaming down his face. Special Agent Miller, the man from the interrogation room, walked into the dining room, his badge clipped to his belt. He completely ignored the screaming guests and locked eyes with Victoria, who had been tackled to the kitchen floor by 2 federal agents, her burgundy dress smeared with floor wax. Victoria Foster, Agent Miller read from a laminated card, his voice cutting through the panic. You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Victoria was sobbing hysterically, the plastic zip ties clicking tightly around her wrists. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess across her face. She looked up at Diane from the floor, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. Diane looked down at her. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just looked at Victoria with the cold, detached expression of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. Take her out, Miller commanded. They dragged Victoria out of the house. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the shattered remains of the Thanksgiving dinner. The perfect family was dead. 2 weeks later, the house was silent. The glass window had been replaced. The Thanksgiving decorations were boxed away in the basement. Aaron stood in the foyer, holding a small cardboard box of his belongings. He looked exhausted, but the crushing weight of the blackmail was gone from his shoulders. Diane stood by the door, wearing a sharp-tailored navy trench coat. 2 expensive leather suitcases sat by her feet. Agent Miller called, Aaron said quietly. My immunity deal was approved by the U.S. Attorney. As long as I testify against Victoria at the federal trial, I won't face charges for the Nexus filings. Good, Diane said, not looking at him. She was buttoning her coat. Mom. Aaron hesitated, his voice breaking. He looked around the massive, empty house. You don't have to sell the house. You don't have to move. We can fix this. Leo and I, we need you. Diane finally stopped. She looked at her son. She loved him. She had burned a woman's life to the ground to keep him out of federal prison. But love does not erase complicity. You knew she was committing fraud, Aaron, Diane said, her voice gentle but unyielding. Long before she blackmailed you, you knew she was stealing money. And when she started gaslighting me, when she drugged me and tried to steal my mind, you looked the other way. You let fear make you a bystander in my execution. Aaron closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the stubble on his cheek. I was terrified. I know, Diane said softly. She reached out and touched his cheek, a fleeting moment of maternal warmth. That's why I saved you. But I can't live in a house with a man who was willing to let me be buried alive. Diane picked up her suitcases. Where will you go? Aaron asked, his voice barely a whisper. I bought a condo in Monterey, overlooking the ocean, Diane said, opening the front door. The crisp winter air swept into the foyer. It's in a secure building, and the Wi-Fi is heavily encrypted. She walked out the door, not looking back. Aaron watched her walk down the driveway to the waiting black town car. The engine purred, the car pulled away, and Aaron was left standing alone in the massive, echoing house. He had his freedom, but he had lost his family. They say getting older makes you invisible. They say society stops looking at you, stops valuing your mind, and just waits for you to fade away. The camera pans over the empty dining room table, settling on the iPad Diane had left behind, the screen dark. Let them think that. Let them think you are slow and weak and confused, because there is no better camouflage in the world than being underestimated. Lies might buy you a beautiful house and a perfect Instagram feed. But the truth? The truth is the master ledger. And eventually, every ledger balances out. Fade to black.